Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. If you're watching these videos, you're either enrolled in my class, so learn it the way that I teach it, what I want you to know, or two, you found it in YouTube land and you need to learn it the way that your instructor wants you to learn it. Either way, I hope these videos are helpful in your learning process. If they are, please hit like and subscribe. If you want to send me a message through YouTube, I read the comments, please comment. I know these videos are very crude in the sense that I have a camera, me, and a board. I'm going to learn how to edit these and make them much more slick in the future, but I'm in a time crunch and I need to get this information out for my students. So anyone else who finds it helpful, I hope that it helps you understand the information. I hope you enjoy the learning process. But make sure that if you're not in my class, you learn all the details and all the information that your instructors want you to learn. But maybe this will help you understand it and know where to plug those details in. All right, so we have been covering tissues, which is, I believe, chapter 4 in our textbook. We've gone over epithelium, connective, muscle, and neural, and then we've gone over membranes and the connective tissue framework of the body. And we did a lot of definitions about tissue damage, necrosis, regeneration, all of that good stuff. Now we're on to chapter 5 in our textbook, the way that we present this material at Del Mar. We are on to the integumentary system and skin. Technically, your skin is an organ. The definition of an organ is one or more tissues that come together and work towards a common function. And our skin is definitely that. It's two layers, the epidermis and dermis. The epidermis is stratified squamous epithelium. The dermis is a couple of other tissues. There's some areolar connective tissue, there's some dense irregular connective tissue, and all of those tissues come together. So the skin itself is an organ. It's actually the largest organ in the body, and it makes up somewhere between like 15, 16, 17% of your body weight. It's pretty heavy. Now, the skin is also the first organ system we're going to look at because it's part of an organ system called the integumentary system. Not only is the skin an organ, but all those little structures that we saw embedded in the skin models in lab are organs as well. A sebaceous gland is an organ. A sweat gland is an organ. A hair follicle is an organ. Erector pili muscles are considered an organ. And so since the skin is an organ, and all of these accessory structures are embedded in the skin, now we have a bunch of organs working together towards a common goal. So our skin is both an organ and an organ system. Now, the third layer associated with the skin, called the hypodermis, also called the superficial fascia, also called the subcutaneous layer, is not technically part of the skin, but it's part of the integumentary system. So we're going to be talking about the skin and some of the other layers that are associated with it. Now, if you're following along in my note set, we are on page 36, I believe, in the note set. And everything that I told you should be in the introduction to this. Now, when it comes to our skin has multiple functions. Some of them you kind of already know. Some of them you don't, and we need to reiterate some of this. So, the functions of skin and the integumentary system, are as such. One of them is protection. Our skin and our integumentary system provides a great deal of protection. A few things. So, it's the first line of defense. Anything that tries to invade your body, unless it gets to the internal membranes, usually has to pass through the skin. So we refer to that as our first line of defense very often. And it protects against a number of things. It protects against pathogens like bacteria and viruses and fungi and parasites. They grow all over our skin. Whether you like it or not, we're carrying bacteria and viruses all the time, and some fungi are on the skin. Our skin, and when we shower and bathe and clean our skin, we're washing them down and decreasing their number, but they grow back every day. Some of those things are actually beneficial to our skin, but nonetheless, it protects us against the pathogens so that they can't get into the body. It protects against things like abrasion and physical damage, like scrapes and cuts and things like that. And it protects against harmful chemicals. So if you spill something on your skin, it doesn't damage the tissue underneath. It just kind of starts to irritate us and we can get rid of it. It protects us from a number of things, okay? So our skin provides a lot of protection. A second function of the skin is permeability. It controls permeability to some degree, okay? Permeability, if I could spell right. So anything that enters or exits our body, again, unless it's taken into one of the digestive system, one of the other systems, must pass through our skin. And we release chemicals from the skin like sweat and sebum and salts and ants and stuff like that. Toxins are released in our sweat. And we can't absorb things through our skin. We are not waterproof. We are water resistant. So if you take a shower, most of the water runs off of you. But if you sit in a swimming pool long enough, you're going to absorb some of the fluids. Okay? So it controls permeability, what gets in and out. A third function of skin is it can provide sensitivity or sensations. Touch, pain, temperature, vibration, we can feel in our skin. And so we're very sensitive there. So it provides sensations. These should all look familiar because they're the same functions of the cell membrane. It can do secretions, sweat, sebum, and there's another secretion called cerumen. So our skin does a lot of secretion, okay? Now, another function of our skin is synthesis. Our skin has the ability to synthesize certain chemicals. There are cells in our skin. One of the things that we synthesize is vitamin D. Ultraviolet light can stimulate some of our cells to develop or synthesize vitamin D. And then vitamin D can be converted to another stuff called calcitriol, which is a hormone that affects our body's ability to absorb and metabolize calcium salts. So we have a lot of synthesis of vitamin D in our skin due to UV light exposure, which is why it's good to get out in the sunshine to some degree so that we can do some vitamin D synthesis. If not, you drink milk that's been fortified or strengthened with vitamin D so that we can get enough vitamin D in our diet. And another function is protection, permeability, sensations, secretions, synthesis. Why am I drawing a blank on one of these? Oh, stores nutrients. There's lots of protein associated with our skin. A lot of the proteins in our skin, like collagen and elastin, can be broken down. So if you were lost somewhere and starving to death, your body will start to digest proteins that are less necessary and move those amino acids so that we can make proteins that are necessary for survival. And lipids in the adipose tissue of the hypodermis, and there's some adipose mixed in the dermis. That adipose tissue is rich in lipids, and as you know, lipids can be an alternate source of energy in the body. So these are the 6 functions of our skin and integumentary system: the protection, permeability, sensations, secretions, synthesis, and stores nutrients. Okay? You should know that. Now, if we start to look at the skin in great detail, we know that the skin itself is only made up of 2 specific layers: the epidermis and the dermis. And then below that is the hypodermis, which is not part of your skin, the subcutaneous layer. So when we looked at the model in lab, I'm going to draw a picture kind of over here, and then I'll modify that picture and look at some detail here. The upper layer of our skin, especially if we're looking at hairy skin, this is called the epidermis. Again, dermis means skin, epi means uppermost. And we would have some hair follicles with hair shafts sticking out of that, okay? We also had some little glands that went to the surface that come down and coil up like sweat glands. And we had these glands that were associated with the hair follicles called sebaceous glands that look like little bundles of grapes hanging off of them. So So we have all these glands in the dermis of the skin. That second layer of the skin is referred to as the dermis. It's a lot of adipose and dense irregular connective tissue. Then deep below that is a layer of fat, and we had all these little adipocytes in this layer. And I don't know if this orange marker is showing up very well. Let me see if this other one does better. Yeah. And I'm not going to draw this all the way across, but you get the idea. This would be the hypodermis. Now, only these two layers together make up your skin. The hypodermis is called the subcutaneous layer, and it gets its name because the skin is called the cutaneous membrane, so this is subcutaneous. It's also called the superficial fascia. And it provides some padding, it stores some nutrients like lipids, and it also helps kind of let the skin slide along here so that when we're contracting muscles and stuff, the skin's not moving with it. The skin will kind of move with it, but the skin's not being slid around on the surface of the body, okay? So when we look at the skin, we need to look at this. Epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis, which is not part of the skin. We have sweat glands, sebaceous glands, and hair follicles, erector pili muscles in there. And all of these structures make up part of our skin and our integumentary system. Now, when we look at the epidermis itself, if I were to just focus in on just the epidermis, where I don't have hair on the body, we actually have, I'm going to change the color a little bit, we have some more, our skin is a little bit thicker up here. In hairless skin. In hairy skin, the skin is thinner, like on the back of your hand. But if you look at the palm of your hand, the skin is much thicker and more durable. When we look at the skin, let's say I'm going to look at this section right here. There are 5 distinct layers of cells above the basement membrane. So now, if I were to look right here where the basement membrane is, I'm going to draw it in blue. So I have a basement membrane sitting here. I'm just going to put BM, the basal lamina or basement membrane that we discussed at the beginning of epithelial tissues. Now, when I look at the skin in great detail, I can see 5 distinct layers of cells. And each layer can be multiple cells thick. The bottom layer, or the basal layer that's sitting down here, are going to be these cells that look like normal, healthy cells. It's not very thick. And one of the things that we know is that this group of cells is referred to, here, I'm running out of room on the edge here. This is called the stratum germinativum. And some books will call it the stratum basale. It looks like the term basale, B-A-S-A-L-E. It's pronounced basale. It means the basal layer or the bottom layer, or stratum germinativum. Now, something that's unique about the stratum germinativum is the stratum germinativum is mitotic. That means these cells are constantly dividing by mitosis, and they would have a nice, pretty purple nucleus inside them. But what happens is the older cells stay behind. As they divide, the old cell stays behind and the new cell can be moved out. If this cell divides again, then this cell will be pushed out by the next cell, and they will continue to divide and push the old layers out. Now, you have to remember that this is stratified squamous epithelium. It's also called keratinized stratified squamous epithelium for a reason you'll see in a moment. Now, because it's an epithelium, it's avascular. So the nutrients have to come from the blood vessels down in the dermis that filter through the basement membrane. And not a lot of the nutrients will. And the further away I get from that food source, the harder it is to get nutrients, and the cells start to starve to death. As the cells migrate out, they start to change shape. And as they change shape, they get very pointy or spiny looking. They get real sharp edges to them. Again, this is not a very thick layer, But this layer is often referred to as the stratum spinosum, which literally means the spiny layer. The cells have sharp edges. And I like to think of it this way. Whenever I don't get to eat for a while, I don't know how many of y'all have heard this term in psychology, but it's called HALT. Hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, right? That's when we get our most cranky. So if your significant other happens to be a really sweet person, but they snap at you for some reason one day, they're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, or they're stressed. So for me, when I'm hungry, I get very cranky. It's hard for me to stay chill when I'm really hungry. It's a big deal to me. Or I like to say, I get bent out of shape. I get all, Well, these cells are starting to starve, and they have changes in their protein structure, their cytoskeleton, and they start to get rather spiny or pointy. So they're called the stratum spinosum. Now, as they move further out, these cells start to change shape a little bit, and then they start to fill up with what are called cytoplasmic granules. They look rather grainy, and they start to fill up with these proteins. I don't want to use this color. So, if I look at this layer under a microscope, I'm going to see all these little granules or grains in the cells. Those little granules or grains are little vesicles filled with protein. And again, I'm not going to do this all the way across. Well, I am going to do this all the way across. It takes a little time. And there's a lot more granules in these cells than what I'm drawing. But nonetheless, we call that layer the stratum granulosum, which means the grainy layer. Okay? The stratum granulosum is filled with little cytoplasmic granules that are filled with a protein called keratohyalin. So in the stratum granulosum, the cells are filled with vesicles of keratohyalin. Keratohyalin is a protein, and that protein is going to be secreted into the tissue. And as it's secreted into the tissue, the proteins will start to link up together and form these little networks of protein called keratin. Now, as the cells start to lose that protein, they hollow out or they become very lucid or clear. And so there will be a layer of cells that are very, very clear and almost see-through. That clear layer of cells, I'm going to write it over here because I'm running out of room, but this clear layer of cells is called the stratum lucidum. Lucid means clear, like if you have a very lucid thought or dream, it's very clear to you. And essentially what happens is they secrete that keratohyalin, and it undergoes some chemical reactions, and it starts to fill up the tissue with this protein that permeates the tissue, and that protein becomes what we call keratin. Keratin makes skin tough and water resistant. So when you take a shower or you walk in the rain, most of the water runs right off of you. This is why you see keratin lotions and a lot of lotions that have kerato or keratin in their names, because it's trying to replace that protein that helps protect your skin and make it strong. Eventually, the cells get so far from the food supply, they start to die and rupture. And what you see is little dead, dried up cells on the surface. And so we end up with these little stacks of dead cells like this. I don't want to use that color. Let me use a different one. Let's see if this is the good orange. Yeah. So I end up with lots of stacks of dead cells. And they're just piled up on top of all of this. I don't know how many of y'all, most of y'all live here in South Texas, go to Del Mar College. So in our culture, there's lots of tamales around. One of my favorite foods on earth. I love tamales. I can eat 2 dozen tamales with a glass of Coke or Big Red in one sitting. Little Tony Chachere's Creole seasoning. Now, when you eat the tamales, what's left over is the empty corn husks. So all the goodness is gone, and we're just left with that. And that's what this to me looks like, is a bunch of corn husks stacked on top of each other in a thick pile. And that helps me learn the name. This last layer is called the stratum corneum. Cornu means horn in Latin, and this is the stuff that actually, if it starts to compact, can turn into horn-like tissue and very hard stuff like hooves. It's very closely related to this. So we have these 5 layers of cells: the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum, the stratum germinativum, the stratum spinosum, and the stratum germinativum. You can remember them in order from a funny saying: can Lucy get some germs? Now, the saying that is taught in most classes is, can Lucy get some grapes? But I like to use germs for germinativum, okay? Corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, germinativum. Or some people say, can Lucy get some bananas? For basale. Corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, basale. Okay? Any way that you learn it, you should know this. This is filled with dead cells. Okay? These are the cells that flake off when you scratch your skin and make most of the dust in your house and you have dandruff. That's the stratum corneum. Okay? So now, if I were to work from the outside in, it's stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, stratum basale or germinativum, the bottom layer up against the basement membrane. The stratum germinativum is mitotic. That way, as the skin cells die and flake off, we're constantly replacing them. Okay? The stratum spinosum just gets bent out of shape a little bit. The unique thing about the stratum granulosum is it fills with little granules or vesicles that are filled with a protein called keratohyalin. The importance of that is, as these cells shed that protein, it gets converted into keratin, which makes our skin very tough and water resistant. And as the cells get clear, we call it the stratum lucidum. And then the cells die and become the stratum corneum, and those dead cells flake off. Now, that's in thick skin, and we only have thick skin on the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. And a rare other place, like sometimes you can get a little bit on your elbows, but really we find this on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, wherever a lot of hair doesn't grow. Now, where there's hairy skin, there's only 4 of the 5 layers. We are missing the stratum lucidum. The keratohyalin gets converted into keratin and distributed throughout the stratum corneum, and we don't have a stratum lucidum. So that skin is thinner and a little less durable. So thin skin is missing the stratum lucidum. If I poked a needle through your arm from here, we would pass through corneum, granulosum, spinosum, germinativum. If I poked it through the palm of your hand or the sole of your foot, we would pass through corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, and germinativum. The stratum lucidum is missing in thin skin, okay, or hairy skin. All right, now, I've covered most of the information that we need to talk about on page 36. You need to look up the difference between sensible and insensible perspiration. What is that? You should know that. We've already drawn the skin and we've talked about it. And I want to talk a little bit about pigmentation. And when it comes to pigmentation, our skin has a certain color to it. And we have all these variations of skin tones, from people who are albinos and have almost no pigmentation whatsoever, all the way to people who have very, very, very dark skin. And what I want y'all to actually think about, especially during these difficult times, is we all have the same stuff. The color of your skin is simply dependent upon a group of cells that live down in the stratum germinativum. And there's a group of cells that can live down here that can secrete different pigments. Pigments are molecules that can absorb some photons of light but reflect others. And depending on which light they reflect gives your skin the different colors. So now, I'm going to erase some of this information, but I don't want to erase it all. So there's two different classes of pigments that I want to talk about. The skin pigments that we can talk about fall under two classes. One is called the keratins. And I think of the word carrot when I think of it. These are pinks and reds, yellows, and oranges in color. Okay? So, the keratins are the same pigments that give leaves the yellow color or the red color or the greenish color and the brown, a little bit of brown but not a lot, as leaves start to fade. The green comes from another pigment that we don't have in our skin called chlorophyll. We don't have that as animals. Excuse me. But think about if you walk through the fruit and vegetable aisle, anything that's pink or red or yellow or orange, squash, banana, oranges, apples, pumpkins, all those reds, grapes, all those reds and oranges and yellows are from the keratins. And we have those keratins in our skin that gives us the flesh tones. The second class of protein or pigment in our skin is called melanin. Melanin is sort of a brown to a black color. And there's a special class of cells in our skin that can produce the melanins, and they're called melanocytes. And those melanocytes can be embedded deep down here in the stratum germinativum. And the melanocytes are cells that can secrete melanin. And melanin can be really light browns, or it can be very dark browns, all the way up to what we would consider to be called black colors, right? So now, if you look at my skin, if you could look at it very closely, I have little spots called freckles that are little brown spots. That's a lot of melanin, but it's only secreted in little spots. It's not all connected. For someone who has really nice tan skin and nice browns to their skin, then they have an even coating of some of these melanins across the skin. For someone who has really, really, really dark skin, if you're African American or if you're from equatorial parts of the world, then you're going to have very dark melanins in your skin, and they completely fill this layer and give your skin a much darker appearance. All of us have melanin, or at least melanocytes, in our skin. The difference in skin tone is how active those melanocytes are, and the more active and more productive they are at producing melanin, the darker your skin can be. Now, melanocytes can also be activated to produce melanin with exposure to ultraviolet light, and this is kind of important. So if I have UV light, let me use red, okay? So if I have UV light or ultraviolet light from the sun, it can penetrate our skin all the way down to these deeper layers. Ultraviolet light, the photons of ultraviolet light are traveling with such a velocity that they can actually impact the DNA in these cells and knock the DNA strands apart a little bit and create what we call thymine dimers. You don't need to know all that. But if we're replicating that cell or we're transcribing a gene, we might miss a few amino acids there, a few bases, resulting in different amino acids. And sometimes if we damage a protein in our cells that stop them from dividing, and we can't produce that protein, then that cell that gets damaged by UV light might start to divide uncontrollably. And as that cell divides uncontrollably and makes more of those cells, then you can get skin cancer. And some skin cancers, like melanomas, can actually get into your bloodstream and travel to other parts of the body and create other skin cancers. So ultraviolet light can directly cause skin cancers if you get too much exposure to it, because it damages the DNA of our cells. One of the advantages to having darker skin is, just like darker glasses, that melanin will absorb the photons of ultraviolet light and prevent the damage to the melanocytes and to the stratum germinativum. So ultraviolet light can stimulate the increased production of melanin. If you go out in the sun, you can tan. Some people produce so much that it actually blocks some of the ultraviolet light, which prevents skin cancer. So the darker your skin, the lower your chances of developing skin cancer due to UV light exposure. The lighter your skin, the higher your chances of developing skin cancer. And anyone who tells you that tanning beds do not increase the risk of skin cancer is a tanning bed owner, and they don't want you to believe that, but they do. One of the things, you don't need to know this, but one of the things that happens is we also have an enzyme in these cells that can correct mistakes in the DNA when there's damage. And those enzymes are also activated by certain wavelengths of light. But ultraviolet light can create so much damage that those enzymes can't correct it before the cell divides, and it can lead to an increased risk of skin cancer. So be careful if you go to tanning beds a whole lot and get a lot of UV light exposure. Anyway, so that's what I wanted you to know about the pigmentation of the skin. I'm going to wrap it up there on page 37 for now. I hope you had as much fun as I did. I hope you enjoyed learning. I hope you learned something. Now go do it till you can't stand it. Do it till you understand it. And then do it 5 more times until you can teach it to someone else. All right? We have a few more videos for this test, so I'll see you on the flip side. Thanks for watching.